Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where today we're going to be talking about the work of Robert E. Howard. Robert E. Howard, the greatest pulp writer who ever lived. Robert E. Howard, who is famous for his creation Conan the Barbarian, the character so many of us are familiar with, if only from the films and the comic books. He also has been in TV series. He was even a cartoon at one point. But nothing could match the original Conan character from the original Conan stories created by Robert E. Howard. Robert E. Howard, a phenomenal writer who wrote like nobody else. Robert E. Howard could draw you into his stories in a way that few writers can manage. When you read a Robert E. Howard story, you experience that story. It's almost as if the process of reading is forgotten. This happens easily in his stories. And boy, did he come up with some great stuff. Most of his stories were published in Weird Tales magazine. His first story, a story called Spear and Fang, first appeared in Weird Tales magazine, which was a story about prehistoric people. It was basically an adventure story. There was no supernatural element in that story. Most of his stories that appeared in Weird Tales magazine did have supernatural elements in them. That's usually what you found in Weird Tales magazine. Now, he did not just publish in Weird Tales magazine, though. He also published in some other magazines because he wrote many different types of things. He not only wrote horror stories and adventure stories and fantasy stories, he wrote historical adventure stories, he wrote boxing stories, he wrote westerns, he wrote a lot of stuff, and he wrote a lot. And so his fiction would appear all over the place. The stuff that we are most familiar with now are his fantasy and adventure stories, of which he created a lot. He also wrote a fair amount of horror stories. Many of those horror stories are in his series of stories that are based off different characters. His horror stories, I've mentioned before, can be found in this volume, The Horror Stories of Robert E. Howard, excellent volume. A lot of his fiction could be found in these Del Rey editions from Ballantine. These are great books. Not all his fiction could be found in that set of books, but most of his really good stuff could be found. I'm going to talk about all of those and some other things that you can find elsewhere. It should be mentioned that a lot of his fiction can be found pretty cheap or free as ebooks, but the editing on those could be a little tricky. You know how it is. You tend to get what you pay for. So I'm going to just be talking about what you can find in print. And you could find a fair amount in print. I'm going to talk about his series characters first, because those are the stories that are best known and deserve to be, because they're really, really, really good. So I'll start off with one of his early characters. That would be Solomon Kane. This is a really interesting character, Solomon Kane. You can find all of Solomon Kane's adventures in this Del Rey book right here. There is Solomon Kane himself. This has some really great illustrations in this volume. The illustrations in this volume are by Gary Gianni, and you can get some just really good illustrations in this book. So Solomon Kane was a Puritan adventurer. A Puritan adventurer. He was kind of a religious zealot. And he followed a path of what he felt was duty all throughout the world. If he found somebody that had been wronged, he would travel the globe to right that wrong. He was kind of obsessive, Solomon Kane was. Very interesting character and very different from the other characters that Robert E. Howard came up with. Came up with a great series of stories. You have Red Shadows, Rattle of Bones, The Moon of Skulls, Blue Flame of Vengeance is in this volume, The Hills of the Dead, which was a fantastic horror story. Some of his best horror stories were Solomon Kane stories, because Solomon Kane, like his other popular characters, often went up against the supernatural, whether they were ghosts or vampires or zombie-like creatures or whatever. Solomon Kane would face them all down. He was a great character, spent a lot of time in Africa because he was fascinated with that continent. He couldn't say why exactly, but he was. And just some great adventure horror stories with a very interesting borderline psychotic character in Solomon Kane. Excellent series of stories. Not as often read as his fantasy characters, his other fantasy characters. He is an historical character. He existed in our historical times, but his stories are very often pure fantasy. So it's great stuff. And it's early Howard. So you get a real sense of his development as a writer reading through these stories, because he developed a lot as a writer when he was writing these stories. So this is an excellent volume and an excellent character. A character I've spoken of before is Kull, King Kull, who was born in Atlantis and had to flee Atlantis. He was in a small tribe in Atlantis. Atlantis wasn't the advanced civilization that we often think of as Atlantis in the Howard stories. But he fled from Atlantis, and he became a number of things. He was a gladiator. He was a slave for a while. But he managed to fight his way to become a king. And he became the king of Valusia. Kull is kind of a prototype Conan in that he was, well, basically a character who fought his way to become a king. A barbarian who fought his way to become a king. And lives and fought in an imaginary world in prehistory. Pretty distant prehistory in this set of stories. And so you kind of get a pretty heavy foreshadowing of Conan in these stories. But the interesting thing is that Kull is not a heck of a lot like Conan, other than the fact that they both fight really good. Kull is more of a brooding character. He would brood, he would ponder. He was very introspective. I suspect that Kull was a lot like Robert E. Howard, whereas Conan was the person that Robert E. Howard wanted to be. He wanted to be like Conan, but he was a lot more like Kull, which makes Kull an interesting character to read about. This brooding king who was also savage and could be set loose as a savage pretty easily. You didn't want to mess with this guy. This volume is fantastic, has great illustrations by Justin Sweet. That's a great cover. And this really captures the feeling of this book. A set of stories that takes place in such a distant past. Everything is kind of barbaric. Even the cities have a kind of fantastic, unreal, dreamlike quality to them. The stories all have that kind of feel. So really great set of stories, the Kull stories. Now the Kull stories at one point do cross over with another character that Robert E. Howard created, which was a really interesting character. And that was Bran Mac Morn, the Pictish king. Bran Mac Morn was a king. In Britain, he was a king of the Picts, which were British tribesmen. But the Picts in Robert E. Howard are kind of different than the historical picks. There really were picks, but in the Howard stories, they're quite a bit different. They're more barbaric, actually. They're more savage. And Bran Mac Morn was their king, and he was fighting the Romans, trying to keep his people free of the Romans who were invading Britain and taking over Britain at the time. And you get great stories in this volume because Bran Mac Morn, again, is a very interesting character. A king of this race of savages, basically, whom very often fought each other, but Bran Mac Morn was able to keep them in line and collaborate to fight off the Romans. And it's desperate and doomed to failure, his fight against the Romans. But it's very interesting. And you get a lot of Robert E. Howard's views on civilization versus barbarism in these stories, that was always interesting when you read about that in his stories. Really dark stories in this one. This one has the story Worms of the Earth, which is a Bran Mac Morn story. One of the darkest Robert E. Howard stories was Worms of the Earth. I think it's one of his best stories. This volume also has the story Kings of the Night, which Kull also has. Because in that story, Kull is brought out from the past through magic to fight alongside Bran Mac Morn and his army against the Romans. So it's a cool team up between Bran Mac Morn and Kull. So really good stories in this volume. They have a different feel, the Bran Mac Morn stories do. They kind of have this kind of brooding, epic quality, and also kind of a sense of doom in the background. It's good stuff. It's good stuff. So those were his chief fantasy characters, those three. And then, of course, he brought out his greatest character of all time, which is Conan. Conan, which he kind of took everything he learned from his earlier stories with Kull and Solomon Kane and Bran Mac Morn and created the Hyborian Age, which existed in the same universe that the Kull stories did, just much later, after Atlantis sank, but still before recorded history. That is when the Conan stories existed. And so you get a series of stories about this character Conan who wandered down from the hills of Samaria, a barbarian who wandered into civilization and started with nothing and made himself king of the greatest nation of his age, and did it through a series of fantastic adventures where he took on different roles and different jobs. He was many things, Conan was. He was a thief to start off with. He became a bandit chieftain. He became a pirate. He became a mercenary. He became a general in the mercenaries. Eventually, he fought his way to kingship. He was other things besides. He was a scout. He did a lot of stuff, Conan did. And Conan was a very clever, he was a very clever man. He was a lot smarter than people give him credit for because they just see the movies and think Conan's this big dumb barbarian. He wasn't dumb at all. He was smart. He knew his business, and his business was bloodshed. And nobody was better at fighting than Conan was. But he did develop as a character too. He changed when he had to take on the role of being a general, for example. Once he found that soldiers who depended on him for their lives, once that happened, he was a lot more careful than he would be on his own. He had to weigh the risks and things like that. And he became a different character from that point. And when he became king again, the responsibilities of kingship changed Conan. He was always a barbarian at heart, but he was an adaptable one. You have to adapt to survive, and nobody was better at survival than this guy. Fascinating series of stories. They do not, they were not published in order. They skipped around in the order of the events that happened in his life. The first story was a story when he was already king. The second story was one of the first chronologically of Conan's saga, when he was still a thief, and it kind of bounced around from there time-wise. And Robert E. Howard's own explanation of that is that if you were just talking to an adventurer in a tavern or something, and he was telling you the stories of his life, he wouldn't tell them in order. He would just tell them to you as they occurred to him. And that's how Howard wrote these stories. He wrote them as they occurred to him. And what a great set of stories they are. Fantastic adventure stories. Fantastic fantasy stories. Even though Conan is well known, I kind of feel like Conan is underrated as a fantasy series. He influenced a lot. Conan did. So those were his main fantasy series. But he also wrote a lot more than that. He wrote a series of historical stories. Most of those can be found in the volume Sword Woman and other historical adventures. This is a great volume because he wrote a lot of just straight historical adventure stories. These have these great illustrations in them. This volume has illustrations by John Watkiss, and it's really, really interesting illustrations in this. Of course, it has the main stories featuring Sword Woman, but it also has just a bunch of adventure stories that take place in the Near East and other places. It's just great fun, this volume. He really wrote some great historical fiction, dark stuff. This stuff tended to be a little darker usually, with some exceptions, than some of his fantasy stuff was. Great stuff. Every bit as good as the fantasy fiction that he wrote. And then he wrote this very interesting series of stories called El Borac and Other Desert Adventurers. This volume has two of his desert adventurers. Has Francis Xavier Gordon and Kirby O'Donnell. And so these were basically Americans in the Middle East who were having adventures around the turn of the century, turn of the last century, and the early teens and 20s. And these are just great stories, just a great series of adventure stories. They are dated, as all pulp fiction is, but I really like this set of stories, this set of adventure stories. This volume has some really interesting illustrations by Tim Bradstreet. Tim Bradstreet, I can't speak. They're just really cool. And also you have some illustrations by Jim and Ruth Keegan in this volume. Just excellent stuff. Look at that. And the stories are just straight adventure stories. And they're just, this volume, El Borac, I would pick this up. If you like Robert E. Howard's other stuff, you will really, really, really like this stuff. Three-bladed Doom. Good stuff, man. So he had his Middle East adventures, with his American adventurers adventuring over there in the Middle East. It was good stuff. El Borac. He also wrote some other things. This is pretty much, along with the horror stories that could be found, like I've said before, in this volume. He wrote a lot of horror, a lot of Lovecraftian type of horror, and a lot of non-Lovecraftian stuff. Some of his best stories were some of his horror stories. But he also wrote some other stuff that can't be found in the Del Rey books. One of the most notable is a novel called Almeric, which I'll just put up here because my copy is back in a box somewhere. And that was a fun science fiction adventure. Unfortunately, all we have of it is a finished first half and kind of a rough draft for the second half, which was finished by some mysterious person. It's still debated who might have finished this novel, but certainly the last few pages don't read like Howard. But despite that weirdness, Almeric is a lot of fun. It's a take off of John Carter of Mars, that kind of story, interplanetary adventure, sword and planet stuff, but with Howard's voice and one of Howard's tough guy characters. It's great, Almeric. Not the perfect Robert E. Howard story. It's a little rough, that's for sure, but still worth reading. He also wrote his boxing stories. He wrote a lot of boxing stories. The pulp magazines, they would come out with stories on everything, sports stories, as well as detective stories, airplane stories, just all kinds of stories. And there was a market for boxing stories. Robert E. Howard not only was interested in boxing, he was also an amateur boxer. He was part of a little fight club, actually, in Cross Plains. They would go to the local ice house and have boxing matches, and he would box. Robert E. Howard was tough. He built himself up into a tough guy, and he would box. And so one thing about his stories, they do have a sense of realism. He knew all about fighting, and you get the sense of that in his boxing stories. They tended to be humorous boxing stories. He had a couple different boxing characters, and they would have humorous adventures. To me, if you've read a couple of them, you kind of get the idea of what they're all about. They're entertaining, but I don't think they're in the same class as his other fiction. He wrote a lot of different types of westerns, including the Breckenridge Elkins series of humorous western stories, and those were very popular, actually. He did all right with his humorous western stories. Not read very much nowadays, but very popular at the time when he was alive. And he probably would have written a lot more of them had he lived. He wrote some other stuff, but those things are those were the major stories that he wrote. And so you get a sense of just how much this guy produced. And it was good stuff. It wasn't hack work. He put himself into everything that he wrote. And it was kind of an impressive achievement, what he was able to do in such a short amount of time. And it's just pure pulp, which is a good thing. Just pure pulp stories. I would recommend anything I just mentioned. But that gives you an idea of just how much he wrote. And we're going to be talking more in detail about his stories next week. I also want to recommend, if you're interested in Robert E. Howard, the individual, there was a great biography written by Mark Finn called Blood and Thunder, The Life and Art of Robert E. Howard. There's Robert E. Howard right there looking just like you would expect him to look, frankly. Robert E. Howard, he was interesting. He was kind of a genius in his own way, living in his lonely Texas town. I like the back cover as well. He liked to drink a little bit of beer once in a while. Of course he would, just as you would expect him to. But this is an excellent biography by Mark Finn. This could be the best book written about Robert E. Howard in 20 years, if not more. This is really, really great. It's important stuff. And it's really well written. You find out all kinds of cool things about Robert E. Howard. Recommend this highly. So there you go, the work of Robert E. Howard. I look forward to talking to you folks more about him and about his work. So I will catch you next time.